David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 46, Intelligence. I must have been married, if I may trust my imperfect memory for dates, about a year or so, when one evening I was returning from a solitary walk. I came past Mrs. Steerforth's house. I had often passed it before during my residence in that neighborhood. It had been uniformly gloomy and dull. I do not remember that I ever saw light in all the house. If I had been a casual passer-by, I should have probably supposed that some childless person lay dead in it. I fell into a brown study as I walked on, and a voice at my side made me start. I was not long in recollecting Mrs. Steerforth's little parlour-maid. "If you please, sir, would you have the goodness to walk in and speak to Miss Dartle?" "Has Miss Dartle sent you for me?" I inquired. "Not tonight, sir, but it's just the same. Miss Dartle saw you pass a night or two ago, and I was to sit at work on the staircase, and when I saw you pass again, to ask you to step in and speak to her." I turned back and inquired of my conductor, as we went along, how Mrs. Steerforth was. She said her lady was but poorly, and kept her own room a good deal. Miss Dartle saw me as I advanced, and rose for a moment to receive me. I thought her then still more colourless and thin than when I had seen her last, the flashing eyes still brighter and the scar still plainer. Our meeting was not cordial. We had parted angrily on the last occasion, and there was an air of disdain about her, which she took no pains to conceal. "I'm told you wish to speak to me, Miss Dartle," said I, standing near her with my hand upon the back of the seat, and declining her gesture of invitation to sit down. "If you please," she said. "Pray, has this girl been found?" "No." "And yet she has run away?" I saw her thin lips working while she looked at me, as if they were eager to load her with her next reproaches. "Run away?" I repeated. "Yes, from him," she said with a laugh. "Ha! If she is not found, perhaps she will never be found. She may be dead." The vaunting cruelty with which she met my glance I never saw expressed in any other face that ever I have seen. "To wish her dead," said I, "may be the kindest wish that one of her own sex could bestow upon her. I am glad that time has softened you so much, Miss Dartle." She condescended to make no reply, but, turning on me with another scornful laugh, said, "The friends of this excellent, much-injured young lady are friends of yours. You are their champion, and assert their rights. Do you wish to know what is known of her?" "Yes," said I. She rose with an ill-favoured smile, and taking a few steps toward a wall of holly that was near at hand, dividing the lawn from a kitchen garden, said in a louder voice, "Come here," as if she were calling to some unclean beast. "You will restrain any demonstrative championship or vengeance in this place, of course, Mr. Copperfield," said she, looking over her shoulder at me with the same expression. I inclined my head without knowing what she meant, and she said, "Come here," again, and returned, followed by the respectable Mr. Littimer, who, with undiminished respectability, made me a bow and took up his position behind her. The air of wicked grace, of triumph, in which there is yet something feminine and alluring, with which she reclined upon the seat between us and looked at me, was worthy of a cruel princess in a legend. "Now," she said imperiously, without glancing at him, and touching the old wound as it throbbed, perhaps in this instance with pleasure rather than pain, "tell Mr. Copperfield about the flight." "Mr. James and myself, ma'am." "Don't address yourself to me," she interrupted with a frown. "Mr. James and myself, sir." "No, to me, if you please," said I. Mr. Littimer, without being at all composed, signified by a slight obeisance that anything that was most agreeable to us was most agreeable to him, and began again. "Mr. James and myself have been abroad with the young woman ever since she left Yarmouth under Mr. James's protection. We have been in a variety of places and seen a deal of foreign country. We have been in France, Switzerland, Italy, in fact, almost all parts." He looked at the back of the seat as if he were addressing himself to that, and softly played upon it with his hands, as if he were striking chords upon a dumb piano. Mr. James took quite uncommonly to the young woman, and was more settled for a length of time than I have known him to be since I have been in his service. The young woman was very improvable and spoke the languages, and wouldn't have been known for the same country person. I noticed that she was much admired wherever we went. Miss Dartle put her hand upon her side. I saw him steal a glance at her, and slightly smile to himself. The young woman went on in this manner for some time, being occasionally low in her spirits, until I think she began to weary Mr. James by giving way to her low spirits and tempers of that kind, and things were not so comfortable. Mr. James, he began to be restless again. The more restless he got, the worse she got, and I must say for myself that I had a very difficult time of it indeed between the two. Still, matters were patched up here, and made good there, over and over again, and altogether lasted, I am sure, for a longer time than anybody could have expected. Mr. Littimer, clearing his throat behind his hand, with a respectable short cough, went on. At last, Mr. James, he set off one morning from the neighbourhood of Naples, where we had a villa, the young woman being very partial to the sea, and, under pretence of coming back in a day or so, left it in charge with me to break it out that, for the general happiness of all concerned, he was, here an interruption of the short cough, gone. But Mr. James, I must say, certainly did behave extremely honourable, for he proposed that the young woman should marry a very respectable person, who was fully prepared to overlook the past, and who was, at least, as good as anybody the young woman could have aspired to in a regular way, her connections being very common. He changed legs again and wetted his lips. I was convinced that the scoundrel spoke of himself, and I saw my conviction reflected in Miss Dartle's face. The young woman's violence, when she came to after I broke the fact of his departure, was beyond all expectations. She was quite mad, and had to be held by force, or if she couldn't have got to a knife, or got to the sea, she'd have beaten her head against the marble floor. Miss Dartle, with a light exultation in her face, seemed almost to caress the sounds this fellow had uttered. But when I came to the second part of what had been entrusted to me, said Mr. Littimer, rubbing his hands uneasily, which anybody might have supposed would have been, at all events, appreciated as a kind of intention, then the young woman came out in her true colours, a more outrageous person I never did see. Her conduct was surprisingly bad. She had no more gratitude, no more feeling, no more patience, no more reason in her than a sock or a stone. If I hadn't been upon my guard, I am convinced she would have had my blood. I think the better of her for it, I said indignantly. Mr. Littimer bent his head as much as to say, Indeed, sir, but you're young, and resumed his narrative. It was necessary, in short, for a time to take away everything nigh her that she could do herself or anybody else an injury with, and to shut her up close, notwithstanding which she got out in the night, forced the lattice of a window that I had nailed up myself, dropped on a vine that was trailed below, and never has been seen or heard of, to my knowledge, since. She is dead, perhaps, said Mrs. Dartle with a smile. She may have drowned herself, miss, returned Mr. Littimer, catching at an excuse for addressing himself to somebody. It's very possible, or she may have had assistance from the boatmen, and the boatmen's wives and children, being given to a low company, she was very much in the habit of talking to them on the beach, Miss Dartle, and sitting by their boats. Mr. James was far from pleased to find out once that she had told the children she was a boatman's daughter. Did I tell you not to speak to me? She said with stern contempt. You spoke to me, miss, he replied. I beg your pardon, but it's my service to obey. Do your service, she returned. Finish your story and go. When it was clear, he said, with infinite respectability and an obedient bow, that she was not to be found, I went to Mr. James and informed him of what had occurred. Words passed between us in consequence, and I felt it due to my character to leave him. Knowing the unfortunate difference between himself and his mother, and what her anxiety of mind was likely to be, I took the liberty of coming home to England and relating. "For money which I paid him," said Miss Dartle to me. "Just so, ma'am, and relating what I knew. I am not aware," said Mr. Littimer, after a moment's reflection, "that there is anything else. I am at present out of employment, and should be happy to meet with a respectable situation." Miss Dartle glanced at me, as though she would inquire if there were anything that I desired to ask. I indicated that I had nothing more to say, "except," I added, as I saw him moving off, "that I understand this fellow's part in the wicked story, and that, as I shall make it known to the honest man who has been her father from her childhood, I would recommend him avoid going too much into public." He had stopped the moment I began, and had listened with his usual repose and manner. "Thank you, sir, but you'll excuse me if I say that there are neither slaves or slave drivers in this country, and that people are not allowed to take the law into their own hands. If they do, it is more to their own peril, I believe, than to other people's. Consequently speaking, I am not at all afraid of going wherever I may wish, sir." With that, he made a polite bow, and with another to Miss Dartle, went through the arch in the wall of holly by which he had come. Reflecting on what had been told me, I felt it right that it should be communicated to Mr. Peggotty. On the following evening I went into London in quest for him. He was always wandering about from place to place, with his one object of recovering his niece before him, but was more in London than elsewhere. He kept a lodging over the little chandler's shop in Hungerford Market, which I have had occasion to mention more than once. Hither I directed my walk. He was sitting, reading by a window in which he kept a few plants. The room was very neat and orderly. I saw in a moment that it was always kept prepared for her reception, and that he never went out, but he thought it possible he might bring her home. He had not heard my tap at the door, and only raised his eyes when I laid my hand upon his shoulder. "Master Davy, thank ye, sir, thank ye hearty for this visit. Sit ye down, you're kindly welcome, sir." "Mr. Peggotty," I said, taking the chair he handed me, "don't expect much. I have some news." "Of Emily?" He put his hand, in a nervous manner, on his mouth and turned pale as he fixed his eyes on me. "It gives no clue where she is, but she is not with him." He sat down, looking intently at me, and listened in profound silence to all I had to tell. When I had done, he shaded his face and continued silent. I looked out of the window for a little while and occupied myself with the plants. "Now, my dear friend," I began. Thank ye, kind sir, kind sir," he said, grasping my hand in both of his. "If she should make her way to London, which is likely, for where could she lose herself so readily in this vast city? And what would she wish to do but lose and hide herself if she does not go home?" "And she won't go home," he interposed, shaking his head mournfully. "If she should come here," said I believe there is one person here more likely to discover her than any other in the world. Do you remember? Hear what I say with fortitude. Think of your great object. Do you remember Martha, of our town?" I needed no other answer than his face. "Do you know that she is in London?" "I have seen her in the streets," he answered with a shiver. "But you don't know," said I, "that Emily was charitable to her with Ham's help long before she fled from home, nor that when we met one night and spoke together in the room yonder, over the way she listened at the door." "Master Davy!" he replied in astonishment. "That night when it snowed so hard." "That night. I have never seen her since. I went back after parting from you to speak to her, but she was gone. I am unwilling to mention her to you. I was unwilling to mention her to you then, and I am now, but she is the person of whom I speak and with whom I think we should communicate. Do you understand?" "Too well, sir," he replied. We snuck our voices almost to a whisper and continued to speak in that tone. "You say you have seen her. Do you think that you could find her?" "I could only hope to do so by chance. I think, Master Davy, I know where to look. It is dark. Being together, shall we go out now and try to find it at night? He assented and prepared to accompany me, without appearing to observe what he was doing. I saw how carefully he adjusted the little room, put a candle ready by the means of lighting it, arranged the bed, and finally took out of a drawer one of her dresses. I remember to have seen her wear it. Neatly folded with some other garments and a bonnet, which he placed upon a chair. He made no allusion to these clothes, neither did I. There they had been waiting for her, many and many a night, no doubt. The time was, Master Davy, he said as we came downstairs, when I thought this girl Martha a most like the dirt underneath my Emily's feet. God forgive me, there's a difference now. As we went along, partly to hold him in conversation and partly to satisfy myself, I asked him about Ham. He said that Ham was just the same, wearing away his life with kinder no care no how for it, but never murmuring and liked by all. We had come through Temple Bar into the city. We were not far from Blackfriars Bridge, when he turned his head and pointed to a solitary female flitting along the opposite side of the street. We followed at a distance, never losing sight of her, but never caring to come very near, as she frequently looked about. Once she stopped to listen to a band of music, and then we stopped too. At length she turned into a dull, dark street, where the noise and crowd were lost, and I said, "We may speak to her now." And mending our pace, we went after her. And that is the end of chapter 46.